From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. There's a Latin saying, cui bono, which means who benefits. That's something to keep in mind during today's episode as we detail a joint Toronto Star National Observer investigation into the proposed Highway 413 that, if built, will run from Vaughan to Halton Hills. This is a controversial stretch of road for many reasons, from municipal opposition to environmental concerns to disputes over how much it might actually help ease traffic. But beyond all that, today we'll be looking at who might initially benefit from this road being built. Steve Buist is an investigative reporter and feature writer with the Star who was formerly with the Hamilton Spectator. He joins us to detail what this investigation has found. Steve, thanks so much for making the time and joining us on This Matters.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay, Steve, let's start about this new highway, the 413. Let's get some basics and backgrounds. Where is it and how is it back in the news?
So the 413 highway was first proposed by the provincial Liberal government and killed in 2018. The route is supposed to go from about Milton down at Highway 401. And if you can sort of picture it, it would loop up and around the GTA's sort of built out edges. So around Mississauga and Brampton, and then across Caledon, and then it joins up with Highway 400 just a little north of Vaughan. And so when the Ford government came to power in 2018, one of the first things it did was decide to revive this highway. And then it's now sort of in the news because there seems to be more and more growing opposition, not just from grassroots groups or environmental groups, but now local councils are starting to now question whether this road, which is proposed to cost, anywhere from $6 billion to $10 billion, is really needed. When you balance that against, what might happen to the environment if you start paving over, some environmentally sensitive areas and some of the farmland that's, in the greenbelt areas just below the Oak Ridges moraine.
I definitely want to get into some of the environmental impacts, and there's been some discussion about that. But for this investigation, what did you guys specifically look at and what did you find?
So obviously, the main questions are, why was this highway revived? Who's going to benefit if it gets built? And what has the government been doing to try to, maybe fast track development along that sort of proposed 60-kilometer corridor? So what we decided to do was to go through land registry documents and corporate searches to see who owns property along this proposed route. And so what we found was that 8 of what you might consider the major prominent land developers in Ontario own thousands of acres of prime real estate close to the proposed route of the highway. So there's about 39 of these properties. They're conservatively valued at about $500 million. Some of those properties have been held for 10, 15, 20 years. And so the value of them may have, in fact, skyrocketed quite dramatically. And so those lands are just sitting there waiting to be developed. And these are some of the bigger names. These are families like the Cordalucci family, the DiMeneghi family, the De Gasperis family, big firms like Fieldgate and Argo Development. And they're sitting on these properties that, could be more lucrative if a highway is put through there and development is allowed to expand outside of the current limits. Then when we looked at these developers, we found that, in fact, most of them have tight connections to the provincial PC government. In total, these 8 major developers and the families associated with them have contributed about $840,000 to the Conservative government in various forms since 2014. About half of them have connections to the PC government in terms of either lobbyists that are former PC politicians or officials connected to the party. One of the developers, for example, employed for several years the head of the PC party's fundraising arm. And so, that's a pretty tight connection right there.
Well, I was going to talk about some of the more specific links to the government. And, considering it's the Fords, there's always a hockey game, right?
So one of the things we found out was that on December 28th, 2018, Premier Ford, a PC MPP. It was Stephen Lecce. At that time, he was not the education minister. He is now, but he is the representative for the riding of King Vaughan, which is where the De Gasperis family's, main companies are based. And so the De Gasperis family apparently has a private box at the BB&T Center in Miami, Florida, for Florida Panthers hockey games. And on December 28th, 2018, Premier Ford, Stephen Lecce, and their host, Michael De Gasperis, attended a Florida Panthers game against the Montreal Canadiens. In response, the government says that Premier Ford and Minister Lecce paid for their own tickets and no government business was discussed during the hockey game.
Okay, we've covered MZOs a fair bit on this show and in the Star. They've been used in this process as well, right? And then there's been some other laws that the government has maybe changed to help some of this process along, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, one of the things we looked at were the MZOs that are related to, properties around the proposed highway. And there are 3 MZOs that have been enacted in the last year. One in Caledon that specifically targets an area where there's going to be some residential development. And then 2 MZOs that are sort of very close to what the terminus point would be of Highway 413, where it meets Highway 400 in Vaughan. And so, those have been MZOs that have been enacted by Premier Ford's government, specifically to speed up development. And those properties are associated with some of the developers that show up in our investigation.
I want to be clear about a couple things. First off, what is the money at stake here? I mean, you've got a conservative estimate of what the land is valued now, but obviously with development, with a new highway, it could be worth a lot more, right? What have experts said about that?
So it's very difficult. One of the things that you discover is that it's difficult to predict land values because a lot of these properties are still being held as farmland. And so until there's some change in zoning, until this land goes from being zoned agriculturally to perhaps, industrial, light industrial, commercial, residential, that's where the real value of the land will skyrocket. Right now, those zoning matters haven't changed, but you can get an idea from some of the properties. So, for instance, there's a couple of the properties that are part of our investigation. And, one of them sold in 2000 for, I think it was approximately $4 million. And last September, that exact same piece of property sold for $40 million. And we found the same with another piece of property not too far away. Essentially, there was a 10-fold increase in the value of that property over a period of, say, about a decade. And this is while these properties are still agricultural properties. So you can see that, we're looking at factors of 10. And if those lands then get approved for residential developments or industrial developments, who knows what that could be. It could be another factor of 10. I'm just speculating here because, again, until they actually get zoned. And then there's things like, okay, so where would they be located? Would they meet the interchange on this proposed highway? Does the proposed highway go through? If that highway gets built, most people say, what really drives land values is access to transportation, whether that transportation is by road or by rail or by air, having access to transportation is what drives land values.
We also have to be clear. These developers at this point have not done anything wrong, right? Part of their whole strategy is to buy land that they hope will one day increase in value or increase in proximity so that it can be developed later, right?
Absolutely. There's nothing improper about developers owning land or buying land. And in fact, as I mentioned, I think something like 3/4 of the properties that we looked at have been held for more than a decade. It's clear that, these developers have been making a long play here. Now, whether that was a long play by design or by bad luck, maybe they wanted to develop it earlier and it just didn't work out. But yes, it's not uncommon for developers to buy land, hold it, and then hope that, at some point, a boundary changes, an urban boundary changes, zoning changes, and then they're not having to buy that land at peak value. Of course, the trade-off is, you have to sink money at the front end and then hang on to it and hope you get your reward somewhere down the line.
We'll be right back. Let's talk a little bit more about the highway and the environmental assessments and some of the fears that people have and activists have about what could be affected if this highway actually goes through. What are we talking about? How much farmland could we possibly lose?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, potentially thousands of hectares of farmland. I forget off the top of my head how many streams and waterways, will be affected. Bridges will have to be built over those things. Part of the land is in the designated greenbelt area. It's all, sort of within shouting distance of the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is a large environmentally sensitive tract of land that essentially, sort of rings the outside of the GTA all the way from the Trent River into Halton region. So there's a lot of concerns that this highway is going to, damage a lot of useful land. And some people are saying, well, you're going to be taking away agricultural land that we need, and all we're going to end up with at the end of it is just more sort of urban sprawl. And, a lot of people are now concerned about, sort of containing not that development in and of itself is bad, but, I think now there's a greater focus, people want to have a greater focus on infilling, sort of using up the space that we've already started using rather than expanding, our sprawl into places that right now are sort of green farm, agricultural producing lands. And I think a lot of people fear that if this highway gets built, it's just going to be inevitable that things will start to fill in around it. You can't imagine that there's going to be a highway that just sits out in the middle of nowhere with nothing around it. Eventually, there will be pressure to put things around that highway. And those things that are going to go around the highway are houses and buildings and commerce and industry.
Well, there's the other question right now. I think there's some dispute as to how much this highway will actually help and be used. I believe, there's one estimate that said that it cut between 30 to 60 seconds of a trip, and then I believe that the government says it could cut 30 minutes. What's the answer there? Do we have truth on that yet without it being built yet?
Yeah, I don't think you could really answer that. I mean, what you're referring to is when the previous Liberal government had a consultant's report on the highway, one of the conclusions was that that road was only going to save drivers 30 to 60 seconds. The Ministry of Transportation now in power says that, in fact, it could save drivers up to 30 minutes. Of course, I don't know what that means. Does that mean from one end of the route to the other? Is it a certain time of day? What conditions are in place? Are they talking about when it's fully built out or not? I don't really know what they're saying. So certainly that's one of the issues. Is this road necessary? On the one hand, you'll have people who will say that there are some forecasts for significant growths in population in the GTA and in Peel. And, the places that are most likely to have the biggest amount of space to grow is Caledon, which is the sort of north end of Peel region. York region is bursting at the seams and is forecast to have even more growth. So, on the one hand, and the government currently contends that, in fact, there's too much congestion in the GTA as it stands now. The highways of the GTA are currently clogged and there's no real prospect of that changing. And so a new highway is needed to sort of relieve congestion and to take into account that there's going to be more and more and more people moving into this part of the world. Others say that, we haven't really done a good enough job of looking at, say, two alternatives. One would be better public transit. So, a more far-reaching, sort of better, say, GO system, for example, with, more stops, more stations, more routes, and a better job of using the highways that are already there. So, one thing that's happened since the pandemic started is that the 407 highway is not nearly as well used as it was in the past. And so a lot of people are saying, well, you could take that $6 to $10 billion that you're planning to spend on this 413 highway and, in fact, use that money to do other things, like, for instance, subsidize truck traffic, get it off of the, 400 series highways like the 401 or the Highway 400, reroute trucks onto the less used Highway 407, and then it's a win-win for everyone. So there's more space on the highways that we're already using. the toll road gets its use and gets truck traffic away from the 400 series highways. So each side is touting the merits of its ideas.
So how are the municipalities up there feeling about this?
So I think what's happening is that the tide seems to be turning. There's winds of change blowing, and I'm not quite sure what's causing that. Some of the councils that were sort of, if not fervently in favor of it, at least, nominally in favor of it, seem to now be having a change of heart. Places like Brampton and Mississauga Peel region. Others are sort of putting their, finger up to the wind to see which way it's blowing. I think what's happening now is that a lot of people are hoping that what's going to happen is that this proposal ends up being punted to the federal government for what's known as a federal environmental assessment. And I think a lot of people are suspecting that if it ends up in the lap of the federal government, a federal environmental assessment is probably not going to be helpful to this highway project, and that might be the death knell for it. Obviously, we don't know that for a fact. And so I think a lot of people are sort of praying that the decision gets taken out of their hands. And then if it ends up in the hands of the federal government, a lot of people can then just say, oh, well, you see, it's not up to us, it's up to somebody else. And don't blame us if it didn't go through. We didn't have a choice.
Steve, this is a big question, and I love this type of story because it is all about following the money. And obviously, we have to be very careful. This is potential money. This is a proposed highway. But one of the things that obviously has to play in this is the optics of the fact that the Ford government is cozy with developers. This is one of the things that people have been criticizing them about their use of MZOs and who they're trying to help. They often say it's about housing. It's about getting stuff built. From this investigation, and I guess that impression that we have, does it look like this is something that would very much benefit these developers? And do you think it's a motivating factor?
Well, I think that if the highway does go ahead and if it is built, it's certainly going to benefit some people. One of the things that we haven't talked about is some of these properties, not just by the main core group of developers that we're looking at, but others. There's some people who are going to have property that's actually on the route of the highway. And for them, that might actually be a deterrent. It may actually work against them because, that land is going to have to be expropriated and they won't be able to develop it. They'll get back the value of that land, fair market value. And in some cases, expropriation will even give you a little bit more than fair market value to take into account the fact that you've suffered a loss here. But it's not the same as, of course, being able to take your 100-acre property and develop it into, houses or industry or something like that. So, there are people who are on the route of the highway that might not do well. But certainly, those people who have properties around the highway, and, these might be other developers or one-offs, people that might have just one property or a family farm or something like that. One would think that if that highway goes through, their land is going to be more valuable. So yes, the Ford government does have a relationship with some of these developers. Does that influence policy? Will we ever know? I have no idea.
Well, Steve, this has been fantastic for us. It's a great investigation, and I think a lot of people obviously are going to be watching this to see if it goes through. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
I think it's one of those issues that, has kind of been simmering out of the limelight for a lot of people. And I think that, it speaks to sort of some of the broader issues that we're going to have to tackle, those of us who live in the Greater Toronto area. This highway is sort of a microcosm of some of the bigger issues that we're going to have to face, which is, where are we going to put people? How are we going to move them around? And who's going to benefit from that?
All big questions. Really want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Steve Buist is an investigative reporter and feature writer with The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajin Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.